The quote for today is from a homeschooling mom. I sent my son next door with luggage. They called and asked why. I said, foreign exchange student program. Today we have this great feast day of the conversion of St. Paul. St. Paul has another feast day along with St. Peter on June 29th, but today he has his own feast day where we commemorate God's amazing grace in the life of Saul of Tarsus. And the conversion of St. Paul is really one of the greatest events in the history of the early church, where the greatest persecutor of the Christians became the greatest apostle for Christ. St. Paul was born in Tarsus, which is modern-day southeastern Turkey, born into a large Jewish population there, given the name Saul. Raised as a strict Pharisee, was sent to Jerusalem to study under the most famous rabbi of the time, Gamaliel of Jerusalem, and he became an avowed enemy of Christianity, whom he considered heretics and apostates. And so Saul would show such zeal to hunt down these heretics. He even oversaw and watched the stoning of St. Stephen, the deacon, the apostle, and then was given authority by the high priest to go to Damascus to arrest the men and women that were there, to go house to house and drag any Christians out of their homes and arrest them and imprison them, perhaps kill them. But on his way to Damascus, he was blinded by the light, as they say, and he heard the voice of Jesus speak, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Notice Jesus didn't say, why are you persecuting my followers? Why are you persecuting the disciples or the church? He said, no, why are you persecuting me? Christ and the church are one. Christ is the head. We are the members of the church. Whatever we do to another person, we do to Christ himself. So Saul was knocked off his high horse, as they say, and was blinded, and then was told to go to Ananias, where he would be baptized and recover his sight. Not only his physical sight, but his spiritual sight. Saul had been blind, both spiritually and physically, and now we see his conversion. I'd recommend looking up the painting by Caravaggio called The Conversion of St. Paul. Brilliant painting where we see the very moment where Saul is knocked off his horse and where he's blinded by the light, and his helplessness, his humility, contrasting that to how he was before. So he was baptized by Ananias, and the scales fell from his eyes, and he could now see that Jesus Christ was truly Lord and God and the Messiah. So then he began to proclaim the gospel, and of course, then he had plots against his life to put him to death, but he escaped. You can read all about that in the Acts of the Apostles. He was now known as Paul the Apostle and would bring the gospel message throughout the entire Mediterranean, unlike no other, considered really the second founder of Christianity. He was arrested ultimately many times, persecuted, and then beheaded by Nero. He could not be crucified like St. Peter because Paul was a Roman citizen. His father had bought Roman citizenship for the family years before. So in the year 64 AD, Paul was beheaded at the spot where the beautiful Basilica of St. Paul was now built outside the city walls. So we think of this moment today when Paul met Jesus, and it changed his life. The amazing grace, this unmerited grace. Nothing Saul did deserved this great grace. But why was he given it? I'm sure because of the prayers and sacrifices of the early Christians. They prayed for him. And St. Stephen, his own martyrdom, the witness, the graces that Stephen merited were given to Saul of Tarsus. And Saul would go on to preach and suffer and be shipwrecked and scourged and flogged and beaten, ultimately beheaded, all for Jesus Christ. It is thanks to St. Paul that we have all these amazing letters to the Corinthians, to the Ephesians, to the Thessalonians, to the Philippians, or as some of my friends say, to the Filipinos. So he died a martyr's death, and today's feast day is a great feast day of hope. because you have a persecutor of the Christians became the great apostle to the Christians. So it's always hope. And I think what we need to do is to pray and sacrifice for any in our society today who are in need of conversion. Of course, all of us are in constant need of daily conversion, but of course we have those world leaders or national leaders or whoever it might be who perhaps are in the special need of God's graces and God's conversion. So there's always hope for them. Let's continue to pray and sacrifice for those especially who might be anti-Christian in different ways in Hollywood or the media or wherever it might be. Pray for their conversion through the intercession of St. Paul. Imagine what good they could do if they would rechannel their energy like St. Paul, his zeal for good rather than for evil. I'll give you a blessing now with the relic of St. Paul the Apostle, asking his intercession for each one of us for continued conversion, and to pray especially for the conversion of our country, our nation, and world leaders. Through the intercession of St. Paul, may Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.